Lorenzo Musetti had retired mid-match in the quarterfinals of the Australian Open against Novak Djokovic due to another groin injury. I was so devastated. I didn't get to watch the game live as I was having surgery at the time. But when I woke up from the surgery, it was one of the first things I asked, and I was so devastated to find out that he had retired from a groin injury. I have since come home from the hospital and I managed to watch the game just to see exactly what went down and why he retired. I'm Monica, a sports physio, and in this video I'll talk through why Musetti would have retired from another groin injury in another Grand Slam, what his rehab may look like, when we might expect to see him back, and how he can prevent re-injury. Musetti felt like he had a tear in his right groin muscle, and when he got asked about it in his press conference, his guess was potentially like his iliopsoas or his adductor muscle.
I'm not a doctor, but it's kind of on the know if it's the abductor or iliopsoas, so I don't know.
He also got asked about his groin injury from the French Open against Alcaraz in the semi-finals there, and he said it was the same leg, but then when I looked back I got confused, and you could see like he was holding onto his left groin and getting treatment on his left groin back then, so he must have just got a bit confused as well. But either way, it doesn't matter because we know that previous history of groin injury puts you at high risk of another groin injury, and they found that in like male footballers. Over half the players that had groin pain in the previous season had recurring or new groin pain in the subsequent season. From what Musetti's describing, it is consistent with a muscle tear. So normally with a muscle tear you feel it at a moment. So I mean, he said he felt it sometime early in the second set, so perhaps he felt like a sharp pain with a change of direction maneuver, but as he continued to play the pain will get worse, and he would have felt it get worse like on change and ends potentially, where you have that slight rest and recovery period, and it might have even then gotten worse when Novak had his medical timeout. So I don't know what he was doing in that time because the footage was all on Novak at that moment, but if he wasn't moving around as much, it would have maybe like rested and cooled down a little bit, so then as he went back to play again it might have felt a bit sorer. Maybe there were some shots later in the game where he just didn't bother to slide to because it was starting to hurt, so it's really hard to pinpoint the moment where I feel he may have hurt the groin at the time, but you could just see gradually over time that he was struggling with the game. Groin pain is quite complex and there's different entities of groin pain. However, the most likely scenario, without assessing Musetti to find out, would likely be the adductor complex. So it's likely that he has strained his adductor muscle, and there's different adductor muscles there. There's a few. The most common one that gets injured is your adductor longus, especially at the upper muscular tendinous junction. Your other adductor muscles include your adductor brevis, adductor magnus, and you also got like your pectineus, gracilis, and obturator internus muscles. So how can the adductor muscle get torn in tennis? Well, if we're looking at the adductor longus specifically, which is the likely scenario that we've been talking about, that muscle can usually get injured when there is a rapid lengthening under load. So to understand this lengthened position, we've got to know that the adductor longus starts from your pubic body and goes down to attach into the linea aspera of your femur. And the muscle contracts and shortens when the hip is in flexion, so the hip is up and bent, when the hip moves across to the midlines into adduction, and when the hip is then internally rotated. So for it to be lengthened, it's got to move the opposite way. So your hip will end up being in a position of extension, so where the legs are sort of behind you. The hip is then outwards into abduction and it's externally rotated. And this lengthened position players get into when they're hitting open stance ground strokes, where they're sliding to the ball, and even just changing direction in general. Your hip goes into that lengthened position too. So there's a lot of load that goes through the hip and the groin. Musetti was saying how open stance forehands were quite difficult for him and even recovering from that position, which makes so much sense in this scenario. So if we were to look at an open stance forehand, your right leg is sort of lunging and sliding out to the side, and it's acting as a decelerator and a brake, and it's literally in that position of length, so your hip is abducted and externally rotated. So the adductor is having a lot of eccentric load, as we call it, and from that position it then has to rapidly shorten and contract to recover, which then puts a lot of load onto the adductor. I imagine he would have even felt a bit of discomfort with split stepping, because as you split step, your adductor has to work as a brake here too, and just any change of direction. Your hip and adductors work really hard with this, especially moving to the forehand side to his right, because then as you're moving this way, you're literally adducting your right leg. Why couldn't he push through and keep playing through this? Well, groin and adductor injuries are really difficult to play with because their muscle action, as we said, is triplanar. So they go up, they work when your hip is back, they work when your hip is out or in, or when you're rotated in or out. So literally any hip position you're in, you're going to load and feel your adductor and your hip complex. And tennis is multi-directional, so you're literally moving sideways, forwards, backs, diagonals. It's impossible to avoid using your groin and adductor region with this, and especially playing so repetitively and at such a high level, and playing someone like Novak or even Alcaraz from the French Open last year, the intensity would have been right up there too. So the adductors and the hip in general gets loaded so much. If Musetti kept pushing through, he would have risked making his tear worse, and taping it would have been so tricky because it's so high up and it may not have even made much of a difference anyway. Continuing to play would have also risked injury in other parts of his body, so like his hip flexors, like his iliopsoas or his rec fem muscle, also his abdominals, because they all also attach onto the pelvis and they work together with your adductors to create that stable base for your legs to move and also transfer load at the same time. So if his adductor was injured, he would have then put a lot more load onto those other structures, especially in ground strokes. Like 54% of the total force developed in ground strokes comes from your lower body. Tennis is so repetitive and he's been doing so many open stance forehands, especially when you're playing someone like Novak. And I think the stat was like, oh no, he did like way more sprints compared to Novak. It was like 30-9 or something crazy. As for when he can get back to play, it will also depend on the location and the severity of the tear. So like if it was at that musculotendinous junction, they usually tend to proceed a bit quicker with the rehab criteria than if it was located at the tendon portion. I would suspect like a minimum 4 weeks. Based off the injury, especially because it's a repeat injury as well. But then again, it depends on the type of injury and how he goes ticking off his rehab criteria. It could even be like 6 or 8 weeks. And depends how much work he then spends in his prevention side of things. He did say in his press conference that the injury didn't feel as bad as the one from the French Open last year. So he has already pulled out of the Rio de Janeiro and the Buenos Aires tournament this year. So that gives him at least 3 weeks of rehab. Last year with the French Open, I believe he had about 3.5 weeks off and then returned to Wimbledon, and then he lost that match. But then from Wimbledon, it then was like another 3 weeks before he returned back to play at the City Open. So depending how he goes this time around, like see how he goes in that 3-week block, he might decide to take a bit more time off to work a bit more on the injury prevention side of things, or again, if the injury's not as bad, hopefully he's able to tick off everything he needs to then come back for something like the Miami or Indian Wells Masters 1000. It was good to see he tried to be proactive with prevention in the off season. Like he did get some baseline measures done before the season started, just to see if there were any weaknesses or deficits anywhere, and he said that the results came back okay. I do wonder though, because as you said, groin pain is so complex, you do need to look at other areas of your body too, whether something like a 3D motion analysis lab could be helpful for him, like seeing how he changes direction, hits his ground strokes, serves, seeing if there's anything that gets picked up there. It's usually way more accurate than just looking with your eye. Now let's have a look at the phases of rehab that Musetti will likely go through. So phase 1 is like your protected loading. You can do like your isometrics, you're working on your motor control, so intersegmental control, then also working on your strength in this phase as well. Last time he had his groin injury, to work on strength, he was using blood flow restriction training, where you have the cuff on there and it occludes and limits how much blood flow is going through your leg. So you've got like a high metabolic stress in the area. And it just means that you can work on building your muscle and your strength without necessarily having that heavy load on that muscle group. Intersegmental control looks at like your position of your body. So like what your thoracic is doing over your lumbar spine and what your spine is then doing over your pelvis, what your pelvis is like over your hips, hips over knees, knees over ankles, and so on. Really important for then later as he transitions into running and changing direction. He should then be working a lot on what we call his deep rotator and abductor strength, his iliopsoas and his oblique strength. These muscles are what we call like joint stabilizing muscles, and when they're working well, they help to offload those large force producing muscles like the adductor longus. In this phase, he should then be building towards that eccentric adductor strength, so strengthening your adductor under length. This will be crucial in terms of you still want to be working on the actual muscle that's been injured to regain its strength back. He has some good baseline measures from off season, so at least he'll know where he was at before the injury happened. Once his crossover test is then pain-free, you can then typically transition into phase 2, which is your return to running, and you're obviously looking at like the mechanics of how you run as well, not just run. You want to be working on your speed first before you build your volume. If he's then managing his running load pain-free, and his adductor squeeze tests are pain-free as well, so at that 45-degree and 0-degree angle, and if his hip internal rotation range is symmetrical, then you can usually transition to phase 3, which is your changing direction and your sprinting. Just to be mindful though, with the internal rotation range, every hip is different, and especially with a high-level tennis player, you might find they can get some joint changes that can happen. So what we call like a cam morphology. So if there's a presence of a cam morphology, that can actually limit how much internal rotation range you have at your hip already. Like that's just structurally your range. So that's why it's good to have those baseline measures before your injury, so you know what's normal for that player. If Musetti does have a cam morphology that's present, he'd be aiming for the range that he had before his injury. So in phase 3, you're working on your change of direction, like biomechanics, and making sure you're in good positions where you're minimizing the amount of load that goes through your hip. And you're also then starting with like planned drills before you go into sort of like those reactive and unplanned drills. Phase 4 is then that return to play transition. So once he is changing direction, pain-free and with good biomechanics, and all those other tests from the other phases are still okay, and his adductor squeeze is pain-free in all angles, so like 0, 45 and 90, he can then sort of start transitioning towards this. He may then decide in this time to go through the biomechanical analysis in the 3D motion lab if you wanted to. I mean, Aspetar are really good at this, which is where Holger Rune is at the moment. They offer something like that, which could be very helpful for him just to prevent re-injury. You want to make sure that load is also being well managed throughout this before he returns to full match play. And throughout the whole process, you're always monitoring the symptom response. So not only during the session, but like the next morning, if there's any discomfort or pain that's present, then you wouldn't be progressing your rehab because you're just going to lightly set yourself back. So making sure that the next morning you're feeling good, so then you can start to progress gradually. So let's have a look now at the risk factors for groin pain, as well as strategies to prevent recurrence. So if we're looking at risk factors, we know that a high level of play puts you at more risk of a groin injury. So Musetti is playing at like the ATP level. So it's a very high level of play. He has also gone from like the off season into the AO. So he had like 7 weeks off, and then he returned this year to Hong Kong, and he played the singles and doubles, and he made the finals of both of those events as well. And then from there, he then played the AO, and obviously had a great run. And versing Novak in itself is a high intensity. But if you're comparing over like a 2 or 3 month period, that 7-week period where he wouldn't have played as much tennis or, you know, that tournament intensity, to then transition into singles, doubles, and then the AO, that's then considered like a high increase in his training load from a frequency perspective, volume, and intensity. And especially in that Novak game, I mean, we know his sprint number was really high. It was like 30 compared to the 9. And so his change of direction units were probably really high in that game too. And as we said earlier, a previous history of groin pain will also put you at higher risk of a groin injury. And using the adductor squeeze, so where you're squeezing maximally for 5 seconds when your legs are straight, is also a really good detection tool to pick up any groin injury that will happen before you play. So if there is a reduction in strength with this test, or there's some pain, this picks up the injury before it happens. And that's where you might need to then examine further, like, okay, why is it low? It may not necessarily be because the adductor is weak. It could be if there's something else that's affecting it. Therefore, when we look at prevention strategies, just doing Copenhagen's alone isn't going to prevent your risk of injury in this area. Yes, you do want to make sure that you always have good adductor strength in the area, especially eccentrically, so loading under length. However, you also want to make sure that your motor control patterns are still good as you're moving, and also making sure that your deep hip stabilizing muscles are working well, just to help offload those big force producing muscles like your adductor longus. Plyometrics in multiple directions, as well as your strength training, will assist to reduce the risk of re-injury. And they actually found that incorporating like low level plyometric work in your warm-up can help reduce the risk of your injury, as well as improve your performance. Working on change of direction mechanics to offload the hip complex, monitoring for fatigue, checking your hip range of motion, adductor squeeze, monitoring your training loads. All of these things are strategies that can be done throughout to try and minimize the risk of re-injury in this area. Thanks so much for listening. I'm really passionate about hip and groin pain, and so I really hope that Musetti can get through his rehab and sort of keep working on trying to prevent the risk of re-injury like he has been in the off season, which is so good. And hopefully he can come back really soon and hopefully dominate and win some more tournaments.